Well, tonight, it's not necessarily one of those guys. It's a friend of the Rat Pack tonight. Ousted Honduran President Mel Zelaya. A couple of days ago, the expelled Honduran president took a few steps across the Nicaraguan-Honduran border, very gingerly, but he quickly retreated back into Nicaragua when he was almost arrested. Now, the U.S. is pushing to get him reinstated after he was forced into exile about a month ago. But is the U.S. misplaying its hand? If we're to stand up for the rule of law in business and in politics around the world, should we be backing the choice of Hugo Chavez and Raul Castro? Let's ask Ambassador Jaime Darrenblum. He was ambassador from Costa Rica to the United States. He is now senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and director at the Center for Latin American Studies there. And Susan Kaufman-Purcell, director of the Center for Hemispheric Policy at the University of Miami. Wow, I am outclassed here by both of you, so I'll do my best to hold my own. Ambassador, first to you. Let me just show folks a picture here. This is a photograph showing Mr. Zelaya with his two buddies, Raul Castro. This is Raul Castro, and that, of course, is Hugo Chavez. Now, Ambassador, that is who Americans see. That's who we see the United States now standing up for, somebody who's embraced by two folks that we consider to be enemies. Is that a correct picture or not?
Well, at the beginning, the United States joined the rest of the countries in condemning what happened in Honduras in terms because it was seen like a traditional coup, a traditional military takeover, which wasn't. And as the days have gone by, officials throughout the region and in the United States, I think, are realizing exactly what's going on. And a more nuanced attitude has been taken. The administration has pushed of lately in the right direction towards a dialogue that would provide a face-saving position to everybody.
Okay, but Ambassador, hold on a second, because, Susan, I got to be a little more frank about what's going on here. This is a guy who's a tough son of a gun. I mean, he's a real tough SOB. That's the kind of person he is. He was raised on a cattle farm. He's used to dealing with people in a tough fashion. He found out that there was real hay to make by befriending Hugo Chavez because he had all the oil when oil went up to $140. And then he played hardball. What he did, the Supreme Court said he couldn't run. There's a constitutional amendment saying you can't run for another term. He said, the heck with that amendment, the heck with the Supreme Court, I'm going to do what I want to do. And that's when the government threw him out of the country, right?
Yes, but even more than that, the military acted at the request of the Congress and the Supreme Court and several other of the country's democratic institutions. And so this in no way was a traditional military coup. In fact, what's happening now is, I think, Latin American governments, in addition to our government and the Organization of American States, is fighting the last war. They're all concerned about military coups, when instead they should be worried about this new model that is erupting through parts of Latin America, whereby a democratically elected demagogue, who is basically an authoritarian type of person, uses the democratic rules of the game to systematically undermine and destroy democracy. That's what's happening in Venezuela, especially. You've also got Bolivia. Those are the two strongest examples of what's happening.
Okay, so when we see this photograph, and I'll put it up again, this is Zelaya in the middle, the guy with a mustache, surrounded by Raul Castro and Hugo Chavez. He's there for a reason. He wants to adopt the model of this guy, Hugo Chavez, who was democratically elected, but then changed the Constitution, changed their whole legal system so that he couldn't be thrown out of town. Is that right, Susan?
Exactly. I mean, what he was trying to do was essentially call a referendum and have, quote, the people that he mobilized support his staying in power. And then he would systematically put all the power, political power, and the economy, slowly but surely, in his own hands.
All right. So
I mean, we should understand it now. It's happened a million times.
Ambassador Darrenblum, we have seen these power plays before in Latin America, where the caudillos, that is, the strong men of Latin America, find ways to manipulate the rule of law so they can stay in power practically basically forever. That's what Chavez is doing, and of course, that's what the Castros did. Are you afraid, as a former ambassador from a Central American country, that we are going to see this as a new trend, particularly because the United States now, in the form of Hillary Clinton as their Secretary of State, seems to be supporting this guy?
I think the situation in Honduras is becoming clearer and clearer by the day, and the odds of Mr. Zelaya returning to the presidency are dropping by the minute, because with his antics and with his statements, it's very obvious that he's an instrument of Hugo Chavez, and he's being manipulated by Hugo Chavez.
But, Ambassador, we continue to have the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, say, we want this guy back in power in Honduras.
The State Department, the authority, most democracies in Latin America officially is one line, but they are taking a more nuanced view and a more nuanced pronouncement in reference to Zelaya, because Zelaya basically has offended all of them by just taking his orders from Hugo Chavez,
all right,
including his host. Yeah.
So, Susan, finally, I just got to ask you, what does all this mean that what we hear from coming out of our Secretary of State is some kind of parlor game, that they have no intention of seeing this guy reinstated in power, but they have to speak to it to please the Hugo Chavezes for whatever reason?
Well, it's not so much that they want to please the Hugo Chavezes. They want to see themselves, I think, too much as part of the consensus composed of also the real democratic countries in Latin America, such as Brazil and Chile. There's a real problem here. You know, the Organization of American States adopted a democratic charter, you know, a decade or two ago. And the problem is that the only way that the charter basically gives presidents the ability to take action against undemocratic behavior. But the problem is that nowhere does it deal with the fact that the presidents are often the ones that are acting undemocratically, and so Congress and the courts, etc., are totally weakened through this charter that's supposedly for democracy. The United States government seems to be focusing too much on the precedent in terms of if they let Honduras stand, then, you know, other militaries will want to act. But there's a different precedent, which is that if we let Zelaya come back, we may be able to let that may be letting the Hugo Chavez model stand. I mean, what happens if they let Zelaya come back and then he starts behaving badly again, and then who's going to remove him?
Lord knows. Lord knows. I don't think it's going to be the U.S. Marine Corps because right now we're backing him. Great to see you, Susan.